Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of What's Up, a space for Asian American progressive voices in California. My name is Albert Kochaphum, and I'm joined here with Jiyoung Park, who is the co-host. And what are we going to be talking about today?
Hey, Al. So what we're going to talk about today is just an introduction to the podcast by discussing our backgrounds and our reasons for discussing this podcast.
Sounds good. So what is the first question we have?
The first question, which is the most important question, is what is your favorite food from the culture you identify with?
Well, the culture I identify with is Thai. As you can probably guess, Thai food is probably one of my favorite foods. And curry is my favorite dish from the culture I identify with. And I can go into lots of detail about what type of curry, but probably massaman curry that my mom has made. And it's like a Muslim type of curry. And yeah, it's like very peanutty. And so... To you, Jiyoung, what is your favorite food from the culture you identify with?
So I am second generation Korean American. My favorite food, I think, is kimchi chan, which is basically a kimchi pancake.
Do you know of any good places to get them in your neighborhood?
There's a place, well, there are a lot of places that have gone under during the pandemic, which is very unfortunate, but there is a place, that's surviving called Kochaphum. And, that was one of, Jonathan Gold's favorite places. It's spelled Kobawoo in K-Town in LA.
Nice. Yeah. Sorry, listeners. I cannot recommend anything because my favorite massaman curry comes from my mom.
Aww.
All right. So, what's next?
What's next is, tell us a little bit about yourself, Al. Why are you doing this podcast?
Yeah, so very similar to you, Jiyoung. I'm first generation. I don't know what the actual terminology is. My parents immigrated here, so does that make me first or second? I don't know.
Were you born here?
I was born here. So,
well, then I think you're second generation.
So I'm also second generation. Parents immigrated from Thailand. They weren't really happy with the situation, so they came here for opportunities, and I was born and raised throughout California. Spent most of my time growing up in the Bay Area, specifically the peninsula, and there were actually a lot of Asians where I grew up in, so I wasn't really isolated. I know some people, sometimes they grow up in kind of like rural areas and they're probably like the only Asians, but it was interesting because I think the high school they went to had probably like 60% Asian population.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty high. I mean, maybe even 70%. I mean, so aside from that, a little bit more of the background and why I started this podcast. So initially, after I graduated school, I wanted to be like a rock star. So I didn't really attend university until like a year afterwards. But after that, I did realize that, my passion's helping the environment and sustainability. So try to do a lot of work in wherever green fields there was in terms of like recycling, composting, zero waste, and like really sustainable transportation is one of my biggest passions, I realized. As an avid cyclist, definitely I try to promote wherever people can use non-motorized or public transit. And so on that notion, I graduated from San Francisco State in 2009. And I went straight to India to do some work with what we call leapfrogging, which means kind of like avoiding pollution and all these bad technologies and getting countries to basically jump over the hurdle of like creating a economy that destroys the environment and things like that. So yeah. Oh, I forgot to mention that I graduated from SF State with a bachelor's in environmental studies. And so that's what equipped me to go to India for 2 years to do project work on zero waste. And so my heart was always kind of in trying to help sustainable development in Asia. So after I spent my time in India, I realized I needed more technical skills. So I applied to a master's program at UCLA. And before I went to UCLA, I ended up spending 2 months in Beijing to kind of like look at pollution there, air pollution. And yeah, so after I graduated at UCLA with all this kind of international experience, I realized that, you know, there could be some more work that I do locally in the States. And I've been working at UCLA for about 5 years now, going on 6, and having realized that there is this kind of opportunity for Asians to be involved in politics and actually have their voices heard, has really motivated me to kind of start a place where people can discuss things. And I really became involved in the US politics in 2016 with Bernie Sanders. And that's where the activist in my kind of blood starts to start working, because I did a lot of canvassing for him in the 2016 election, only to have him kind of be decimated by the DNC behind closed doors. And we could talk about that a little bit later.
Don't get me started.
Thanks. So yeah, I mean that's where I came across, and we can have this episode on the DNC and Bernie probably in the future. But yeah, really seeing what happened to him again in 2020 and the results of the 2020 elections, particularly in California, really, yeah, I wanted to make sure that progressive Asians aren't isolated, and that we can kind of network with each other, even with non-Asians and other progressives, to really, just build a coalition and, you know, help each other out. So that's my long-winded reason why I started this podcast. So when I came across Jiyoung, I was really happy to hear that, look, there isn't actually another Asian who's interested. But yeah, so what about your background, Jiyoung, and how come you decided to hop on board?
Okay, so I actually didn't know all of your activist experience and credentials. So that was like super impressive. But I really have to know one thing. What instrument did you play?
Thank you. I played the drums, actually. So,
cool.
Yeah, if you ever need a drummer, let me know. But I also play.
I play bass.
Oh.
Anyway, another time.
Yeah, it's another time. But yeah, bass is cool. But I also play guitar. So.
Cool. Yeah, so I have been an activist since I was in high school, really. I was part of a teen coalition that was protested against the wars that were happening. And I became a part of the National Lawyers Guild when I was going to Loyola Law School. And let me back up. I'm born and raised in Los Angeles to Korean immigrants who came here for, you know, the quote unquote better life. Korea at the time was still recovering from the Korean War. And so their economy was not super great. And every Korean just basically thought of the US, as many other people did in the world, as the land of milk and honey and where dreams come true. And so it was actually my grandmother who came alone at the age of 50 after having 7 kids, and without speaking any English, landed in Oklahoma, of all places, as a trained nurse, but was not able to actually work as a nurse, that whole story. And my father came as a, by himself, worked his way through business school at Pepperdine. So, I grew up in LA, went to college in New Orleans at Tulane, and then went to Loyola Law School. And so in law school, I joined the National Lawyers Guild, became a legal observer, and also did pro bono criminal defense. I defended a protester who got arrested at Occupy when the cops cleared out the Occupy camp. I defended a woman a little old lady from Pasadena who did a sit-in at a bank way back when the banks were foreclosing on people in the last recession. And I also defended one of the Black Lives Matter folks who got arrested on the freeway when Trump got elected. And then I created and ran a jail support project right when the George Floyd protests started up at the end of May. I created it from nothing. And we went hard for 2.5 weeks and supported the tons of protesters and wound that down after about 2.5 weeks. And then I just became super activated in a way that I never have before. I helped out with the voter guide that the Future Left did for LA and Orange County. And then a woman named Unilee Jost, who is a hardcore activist here in Southern California. She called me up and asked if I wanted to run for an assembly district delegate position in my assembly district. Then I decided to run so that I could have a say in the Democratic Party, which I do not love, but would like to change because of the practical impacts they have. And I see a huge need for AAPIs to talk about AAPI issues with respect to social justice, equity, and politics. We need a space for ourselves. So that's why I'm doing this.
Wow, thanks. I mean, that's a really inspirational list of kind of like long-standing activism since high school, really. So, I wish I was kind of that activated back then. But I mean, obviously, I've always tried to keep altruism at the forefront of things that I do. For me, I've always felt like the U.S. politics has been jaded. So I kind of gave up on the U.S. since like university. And yeah, did you have something you wanted to mention?
Yeah, well, I mean, I haven't been, gung ho activist all the way since high school. It's just that I have just kind of had that kind of outlook since I was young. But like I said before, I mean, I'm more activated now than I have ever been before.
Well, that begs the question then, and this is one of our discussion questions, like, where do you lie politically?
I would say that because of all that's happened over in the past year, both because of the protests and because of the pandemic, it's really made me do a deep dive into like the root of injustice and inequity. And I would say it has, like, the past year has radicalized me in the sense that I
are throwing Molotov cocktails.
I have wanted to, but I haven't. No, I wanted. I mean, there's, there are different roles for different people, and I personally really want to look at changing the system fundamentally. And so that to me means that I am, I guess, what one would call a leftist. And I think that the government needs to play a bigger role in ensuring equity and justice as much as possible. And I mean, I even think that the Constitution should be written. So
rewritten.
That's where I am.
Right? Rewritten?
Rewritten, okay, yes. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. How about you?
Well, I guess
where do you lie politically?
Interesting. Because reflecting on what you said, I've actually probably have been radical all of my life. Probably just looking at the generosity of my parents and having visited countries, Thailand when I was young. I've always seen poverty as something that's been everywhere, both outside and within the US. And I've always questioned it, like, why are there people still starving? Why is there inequity? From a young age, I've always wondered what drives this. And I would say, politically speaking, I am pretty far to the left. Probably, socialist, if not communist. But to me, those are just labels because, I mean, free market makes sense for things. Like, I always justify it in non-essential goods like entertainment, media, games, whatever. Like those things, yeah, sure, let the free market have its role there. But for essential goods like water, electricity, education, healthcare, that I believe is all needs to be provided and given as a right, because people deserve that. And as a once burgeoning artist myself, I always kind of get annoyed because I'm like, I really want to just be doing art, even though I'm not that good at it. At least I want to be doing it. But like the society right now makes it such that there are pressing things like climate change, the social injustice that you've brought up, and all these other issues that need to be taken care of before one can actually like fully invest in something like art. That's my kind of like reasoning behind just shifting away from that. But obviously, I think everyone has different values, and I just think that a lot of the problems that we face are because of institutional issues, and whether it's environmental injustice or all these other kind of systemized forms of racism. I just think that there's just too many things to be kind of addressing. And that's not to say, though, that art doesn't have any place, but because people do need to unwind and they do need to have time for themselves, as we're all human. And that's one of the reasons why, later on in the next episode, I wanted to bring other activists to talk about, how do you avoid burning out and things like that. But so that's kind of where I lie in terms of politically, so super far left, but I do recognize that, okay, free market works in some locations, but for the most part, we need to have the base be the same before we can actually have this idea that people can go ahead and do whatever they want to make ends meet.
That's funny that you say that about art, because I actually feel that it plays a totally essential role in change, in fundamental change, because I think electoralism, meaning, change through elections, can only go so far, as we've seen already.
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree.
And so, how do we change people who don't agree with us? And part of that solution, in my mind, exists in telling stories. And so I think that, even watching films and TV, not just with representation, but also telling our own stories, really makes people see that at the end of the day, we do actually want the same things. And so I actually very much believe in the role of art in change.
Yeah, no, I totally didn't mean to undercut the value of art in that sense. I just meant for my personal self that I like to do art just for the sake of doing it, which
totally
I like in an ideal society, and that's where idea of socialism / communism makes sense, where it's art should just be done for the sake of it. But no, I definitely agree that art is fundamental to allowing the communication to really address and empathize with one another. I will say that
totally.
In terms of change, I mean, this is one topic that we can probably dive into at a later time. But how do you make change, and what type of change are we trying to look for? I mean, I think there's it's typically a 3-pronged approach, right? Where there's legislation, laws that are implemented, and those are kind of the reasons why people go out and protest. And there's the legal kind of ways to deal with different courts and how they're interpreting laws. And then there's the third one, which is kind of direct action. I don't know if those are the same 3 that you may agree or disagree with, but typically that's what I've heard. But thoughts?
That sounds about right. I wouldn't I would say like it's not necessarily in that order of importance.
Oh no, for sure.
Yeah.
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, I think direct action is usually. Anyways, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, direct action is, I think we're seeing is playing a bigger and bigger role. I think the success of the Bernie campaign was in grassroots organizing and mutual aid and direct action is kind of taking the place of the people of the activation that had happened around the Bernie campaign, and then taking it even further. And it's just an incredibly important organizing tool.
Sorry, for those who might not know, what is mutual aid?
Well, what is mutual aid? It's basically people looking out for each other in material ways and, in other ways, emotionally and whatnot. I would say, like most people see it in like food drives, clothing drives. Let's see. What else have you seen in terms of mutual aid?
Oh, I was hoping you were going to say K-Town for All was one good example of an organization that is doing a lot of mutual aid, I think, right? Along with the food pantry and stuff.
Definitely, like advocating on behalf of the unhoused against sweeps that displace the unhoused and take away their positions. Advocating for people on the ground, I would say, which can look like so many things. I mean, there's one group called Hydrate LA that just provides water. And I don't mean to say just as if it's like any less important. I mean, like that's their sole purpose. Mm-hmm. And of course, water is extremely important when you're unhoused because there aren't a ton of sources for it, especially when establishments are closed down, and they were also handing out water when there were the elections and people were waiting in lines.
Yeah, well, I mean that actually reminds me of when I was super I was ready almost to get down to Standing Rock and help with the protest there for water is life. Unfortunately, the weekend I was going to go, they stopped the protest. I was like, darn.
Oh man!
But I mean, it was insane. That's another tangent. But I mean, but it is an example of the continuing injustices I think that are plaguing, especially indigenous folk that have really been treated unjust from the very beginning. So I mean, I definitely think that there's a lot that we can unpack in these episodes coming down the line. So I mean, the structure of the podcast, it's kind of what we just went through, right? We introduced ourselves. We then introduced the interviewees, which in this case was actually me and Jiyoung. And then we open it up with kind of like a icebreaker question, and then we just dive into a discussion / interview portion to really let the guests kind of have a place to either vent or share their stories. And for us, we just want to highlight a lot of the good work that other Asian American progressives are doing. And Jiyoung, you mentioned this before, that the AAPI is missing, and we are definitely including the Pacific Islander community. It just doesn't fit in our title, so I'm sorry about that. But yeah, so the structure is essentially like we'll have a little discussion and then recap, and then we'll kind of leave with a food for thought for next week, as well as what we're going to be talking about in the next episode. So, Jiyoung, do you want to do the recap?
Yeah, sure. So, we're here doing this podcast to create a space for Asian American progressive voices in California, because we are in California and there are a ton of Asian American progressive voices here, although we totally support the rest of the country and the world in doing the same thing. And we're both super lefties.
That's all you need to know, everybody.
and we're both cyclists, and we both want to change things radically. And so we're going to talk to various people who are Asian American and trying to do the same thing.
Yeah, and just really learning about each other and how we can really, grow this network out. And then, like Jiyoung, you mentioned, not just to be exclusive to Asian American Pacific Islanders, but definitely we want to, anyone who's interested in our issues and the issues that we are trying to push to make change is welcome, right?
For sure.
I definitely feel that one of the most important things that we want to be able to do here is to acknowledge kind of our biases and really, move beyond that so that we can engage with those who may disagree. And it's important because I think with Asian Americans in particular, the elder generation, there is this kind of immediate reaction to like the ideas of communism or socialism, when in fact, like literally the fire department and the public roads we drive on, those are all socialists. Social security is literally socialism right there. So, when Bernie Sanders says we have rugged individualism for the poor and like socialism for the rich, he's pretty much on it.
Yeah, I heard recently that healthcare is one of the most important issues to AAPIs, and that's meaning having access to healthcare, and that's universal healthcare is socialism. It just has it's like the S word and has a bad name, but it's really just about one of the richest countries in the world providing a basic level of services to tax-paying people, whether they're documented or not. We're all paying taxes. And as we see in the pandemic, we have to, everyone should have access to healthcare just for public safety in general.
Yeah. I mean, that's really crazy how the Medicare for All is kind of on everyone's radar, but the politicians who are supposed to represent us, they do not have that as a top priority item. And well, instead of what we've gotten is the Obamacare kind of like convoluted system where, I mean, I've applied for my family and it's insane how bureaucratic it is. Like you have to apply at the state level, and then at the state level, it goes down to the county level. And it's just like, if you were a non-speaking like native, it's difficult to actually get those requirements. And yeah, I don't know. It's just
okay. Even if you can get past all that signing up stuff, right now there are millions of people who are unemployed and just can't even pay the premiums for ACA. So like, if somebody gets sick with COVID, what are they supposed to do?
Yeah, I mean,
it's a public health issue. It's a
I mean, at the end of the day, too, it's a moral issue. I think as a society, I mean, and again, going to what Bernie has said, like society should be judged by how we take care of its poor. He wasn't the only one who said that. He said most vulnerable population, and he quoted somebody else from that. But that's kind of it's very interesting because a lot of people who are religious, especially Christians, they kind of compartmentalize sometimes the notion of socialism being evil, where in fact I would argue that Jesus is probably one of the first socialist people around, talking about needing to feed the poor and take care of everyone as they were your own neighbors. I mean, yeah, that's kind of the spirit of socialism in my mind.
I would just like to point out the fact that Jesus was not white either.
That is another very important point. I mean, yeah, those are very. I mean, and he was also an immigrant, so don't forget that. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's interesting that people almost put value of money and capitalism on top of moral obligation and just being a decent person.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like the moral argument is always just a given to me, but I end up a lot of the time just making arguments that I kind of are catered more for the people who need to be convinced. And unfortunately, a lot of those arguments have to do with how they personally benefit from what I think should be happening.
Right. So on that note, so the themes that are coming up in terms of the podcast, we have a whole year of episodes lined up. But just to give a quick example, one of the themes that we are going to do for Black History Month is anti-Blackness in Asian America. But more, I guess, closer to the election or inauguration, actually, of Joe Biden, we're going to have the Asian Americans in a 2020 election. And we're going to talk about how Asian Americans in California, particularly, voted very conservatively, and what the implications are and how can we kind of address that going forward. So, yeah, those are kind of the just some examples of topics that we're going to include. So I hope we have a wide variety of issues that people can talk about and would be interested to hear. If you have any suggestions, feel free to reach out to us. That leads to the other section or question now is how and where to stay connected. So go ahead, Jiyoung.
Oh, I was just going to say we're around on all the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. What else are we on?
We are on also most podcast platforms. So, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud. And so we have started a Discord group where you can go ahead and provide us with any information, suggestions, contacts.
What's the handle?
So the handle for most of our content is, for example, our Twitter handle is at WhatsApp AAP podcast. So that's generally our handle. For Discord, the invite is going to be linked on wherever you're listening to. So feel free to just drop in there. Anything else you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I'd like to ask folks to like this podcast and leave a comment and rate it if you can take a second to do so.
That's very important for us to get exposure and to connect with others. So yeah, that's very, very good points and suggestions. So the next episode for the week of January 4th, it's the new year. 2021 is titled What's Up as an Activist? And so essentially we talked about ourselves quite a bit and how we are quote unquote activated or activists. And so next week, we'd like to invite Claire Lau to talk about how she is an activist and how...
Who is Claire Lau?
Sorry. So Claire Lau is a co-founder of SF Bernicrats. It's a San Francisco progressive organization endorsed by Our Revolution. And she's going to talk about just becoming an activist. So Our Revolution is the Bernie Sanders 2016, post Bernie Sanders 2016 group that formed to endorse local progressive organizations throughout the United States to push forwards a lot of the issues like Medicare for all, tuition-free colleges, and all these other things. So help to just kind of validate the progressive agenda for these organizations. And they kind of endorse nationwide to really get more exposure to candidates and people that might be running. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm looking forward to talking to Claire.
Awesome. But just some food for thought, thinking about what we talked about today. How have you been activated? Or if you haven't been activated, what might you choose to be your first topic of tackling? Jiyoung, any other last messages you'd like to share?
I would just say join an organization. That's what I have to say.
That's how we got connected. We didn't share that story, so that will be another day.
Okay.
But yeah, so thanks again for tuning in. Remember that we drop our episodes every Monday at 1 p.m. PST. Also, I would like to give a final shout out to Jackie Ho, who helped to edit the content as well as make sure the production for these episodes goes smoothly. And looking forward to seeing everyone again next week. See you then.